Hello everyone, I hope you are having a fantastic day and week. Today I would like to talk some more about recent political developments in the United States of America. Namely, I want to talk about the United States and Iran war, the decision to place ICE agents in airports, and the partial government shutdown which led to that decision being made, and a new piece of Florida legislation which mandates, quote, anti-communist classes in public schools. So before we begin talking about these political developments in depth, I want you to know that I left the sources for my research in the description. Also, if at any point you disagree with anything I say, or if you want to explain your own take on situations, I encourage you to leave a comment. Thank you, and enjoy the video. So, the first thing I'd like to talk about is the war between the United States and Israel against Iran. Now, obviously, this war is problematic because it's a fucking war, and it's just bad as it is. We have developed and progressed more than enough as a society to understand that very few wars are justified, and that no wars end without suffering for both sides. In this case, though, the war is being brought to the Iranian homeland. This means that the people who will take most of the blow are the Iranians, more specifically, the innocent people in Iran. I'm sure you've heard of the American strike on Iran near the start of the war, which resulted in the killing of their leader. However, this strike also led to the murder of about 1,400 civilians as collateral. And while I will never support a dictatorial or far-right regime, which Iran most definitely was, the government under which the people live does not justify their murder. The United States of America and its puppet state of Israel have started a wholly unjustified war that has already resulted in more than 1,000 innocent people dying. There was no proper justification. All it took was a madman in the most powerful position on planet Earth to decide that he wanted someone else to suffer, and so they did. What's more, the United States will definitely not be able to win this war. I know that may be hard to believe for a lot of people, especially those of us who are victims of the American education system, but there's really little chance of us winning this war, whatever the condition of victory might be in this case. First of all, the Iranian military has numbers that are not insignificant. The standing army consists of about 500,000 Iranian troops, while the American military has 1.2 million. And while these statistics seem to be in our favor, the truth is that the United States does not have the logistical capacity to transport or take care of 1 million troops so far from home. Numbers and equipment do not always guarantee victory. This has been confirmed time and time again, especially in the case of the United States, in nations such as Vietnam and Afghanistan, which we most definitely did not win those wars. Secondly, the people of the United States are already suffering the domestic consequences of this war. The oil prices have already increased by nearly 50%. That means every single person who drives a gas-powered car will pay the hefty price of this war. That also means that your electricity bill might increase because if you are near an oil power plant, of course, that'll have higher cost goods. Combine these increasing gas prices with the already horrific cost of living crisis, and we, the people of the United States, will struggle more as time goes on. As if the economic issues weren't enough, the war is also deeply unpopular. Most American people do not approve of this unjustified and clearly imperialist war. In a recent poll by the BBC, it was found that only 1/3 of Americans support the war and Trump's handling of it. And the conservatives will be quick to say some shit like, if you don't support this war, you're against the dictatorship of Iran, or you're anti-American, or you're not a patriot, which is just a cheap attempt to demonize the opposition. And it's really laughable, honestly. It gets to a point. It's just continuous and it's predictable at this point. If hating endless imperialist and deadly war is anti-American or unpatriotic, then I think we really need to reconsider what it means to be an American person and patriot and citizen, right? And even without significant combat so far, the war is already harming the American population. And it also seems like soldiers don't really enjoy the idea of going to war with them, because there was a recent incident involving a laundry fire on one of our super carriers stationed in the Middle East recently. A fire reportedly broke out and caused a lot of crew members to suffer from smoke inhalation, and a damaged control member even to be injured by it. Now, I don't want to make a baseless claim here, but I don't think that the laundry fire was entirely an accident, right? I mean, seriously, a fucking laundry fire breaking out in the only carrier that's deployed in the Middle East, and it got so big that it forced the ship to go all the way back to Greece? What are the chances of that? Right? I don't know if a crew member did it intentionally, but I really wouldn't blame them if they did. Who really wants to fight a war for a bunch of rich men who don't care about you anyway? The American-Iranian War has, as of April 7th, pretty much been lost by the United States. A ceasefire which was accepted by both sides on April 7th saw that the United States and Iran would stop fighting, and that Iran would critically gain control of the Strait of Hormuz, and the Iranians have begun to charge a toll for every ship that crosses the strait, which is definitely going to provide them quite a nice income, which they did not previously have. And you won't be surprised to hear this, probably, but the ceasefire lasted less than a week. On April 13th, in response to the Iranian blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, the United States decided to blockade the blockade. And that doesn't really make much sense, but I think that's pretty in character for our president and the situation he has brought us into. I have no idea what the hell the end goal of this ridiculous war is, and I really have no idea what Trump is smoking. I like to think that he really is just this stupid and is also, thankfully, far too incompetent to secure his power as a dictator, but I really have a feeling that there's a much more sinister strategy being employed. To conclude, I would say that this war was facilitated entirely by the greed of American and Israeli elites rather than any sort of care for the Iranian people, like many conservatives would argue, right, with the protests and such that happened previously this year. And I think I'd like to predict that this war will not go in our favor at all, which is a pretty safe bet to make, I think. So the longer we stay in this ridiculous war, the less stable and powerful the United States will be, and we're going to continue to become a laughingstock to the rest of the world, and the American people will suffer for their actions of our basically treasonous government. If the United States pulls out of Iran now, our rivals will see our administration as incompetent, which they are, and our military as weak. If we continue fighting, more innocent lives will be lost and the domestic situation will worsen, and if, God forbid, we resorted to nuking them, which I really wouldn't be surprised if Trump did because it's Trump, we will be immediately shunned by the entire world and our empire will fizzle out at the expense of every normal, non-elite person in the United States. In every case, the most powerful amongst us will not suffer, and only the people will. Only people have suffered in this war, and only people will continue to suffer in this war. The next topic I'd like to talk about is the deployment of immigration and customs enforcement officers in airports. So Trump's decision to deploy ICE forces in airports was justified by the partial shutdown of the United States, which it entered on March 18th. The shutdown did not hit all government services like the previous one in January did, but it did have a very brutal effect on airports and the TSA. Over time, TSA agents had to stop going to work because they literally weren't being paid, right? There was no funding from the government to pay for their salary. And the partial shutdown was very much avoidable, if you ask me. For context, the partial shutdown began after ICE forces killed Alex Preddy, and Democrats in Congress decided then to finally do the bare minimum and try to fight the growing power of ICE in America. And thus conflict began in Congress between the Republican majority and Democrat minority over the funding of ICE and Homeland Security. Obviously, because the Democrats are still right-leaning, there was no call for the abolition of ICE. Instead, Democrats mostly suggested funding for more body cams and the reduction of power of ICE forces, things along those lines, right? So this conflict caused funding for many government agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, to cease temporarily. And as a result, TSA agents could no longer be paid full paychecks as there was no funding available. And this has caused gargantuan lines, the likes of which I've never seen personally. And if you've seen any videos of these lines on social media, you'll know how bad they were, right? A lot of them stretched well outside of the airport, and you could arrive hours early and still miss your flight. So to fix these issues that he caused himself, our glorious President Trump decided to use ICE to fill the vacancies of those TSA agents who could not show up because they weren't being paid. The issues with this decision is two things. One is that the ICE agents are not trained for TSA duties, and two is that the whole thing is probably just a thinly veiled attempt to launch a fear campaign against the American people and crush dissent, that sort of thing, right? So ICE forces are not even trained to do their normal job. As was made evident by the murder of 2 U.S. citizens and the unjust arrest of hundreds of others who were also legal citizens, you can see how ICE forces just literally cannot properly enforce immigration and customs, which is their job title. Unless you'd like to argue that this is exactly what they're supposed to be doing, in which case I would probably agree that, yeah, they're doing their job pretty well at that point. Nonetheless, if ICE agents can't even complete the assignment for which they are explicitly trained for, then how the hell can you logically justify the movement of ICE forces to new positions which they also haven't been trained for? And what is the point of an immigration officer in airport security, right? Especially when you have these domestic flights, it's just like you're putting them in an area where they don't have the expertise to do it, and they're not even supposed to be there. The whole thing is just reeking of incompetence. The second issue is a lot more concerning. So the Democrats and old guard liberals would argue that ICE agents are only assigned to peaceful deportation, they're doing their job poorly, and they need to be trained more, that sort of thing. But it is becoming increasingly clear to many that the goals of the fiercely conservative establishment in the United States are hardly to do just that. Right? The deployment of ICE forces to largely nonconformist, diverse, and liberal or occasionally leftist cities is not a coincidence by any means. What we are seeing in real time is an attempt to establish a fascist tyranny in this disguised third world country that we call the United States of America. The deployment of ICE forces in airports is not done to help TSA security lines. Let me be very clear. It is done to incite fear within every American citizen. If the people believe they are always being watched, if they observe these figures that they've begun to associate with fear and harm everywhere they go, then they will be a lot less likely to rebel against increasingly authoritarian far-right threats in the United States. This deployment is a trial run for something worse that will happen, and Trump will find an excuse to continue to escalate this deployment of federal forces across the United States. ICE has failed to help TSA significantly with the reduction of security wait times as well. But really, it's succeeded in its true task. We cannot ever tolerate the harming of others, and because ICE's sole goal is to do so, we can never tolerate them. Abolition of ICE is the only correct answer. The last topic I'd like to talk about is another questionable choice that has been made in the American political scene, and it's the decision to mandate anti-communism classes in Florida public schools. And that is the terminology used, mind you. So the Florida State Congress and Governor DeSantis decided to create legislation that would require an anti-communist curriculum to be implemented in grades K through 12. Furthermore, every school year, at least 45 minutes need to be allocated to teaching about the, quote, horrors of Marxist-Leninism. Don't get me wrong, I'm not exactly fond of communist dictatorships, but this legislation is very concerning for a lot of reasons, and teachers have already expressed concern because the nature of the legislation seeks to teach students what to think instead of how. The class reeks of political brainwashing, and the name literally implies that it exists solely to deter students from an ideology, which should not be what is happening in any liberal democracy. The bill claims that the class will simply teach about the history of many tragedies under communist dictatorships, but I really do not trust the Floridian government to be truthful in these lessons. Really, this class should be unnecessary. If communism is as bad as the Floridian government and Congress believes, then the schools should simply teach world history instead. That way, students will be taught the truth about what has happened in the past, and they can make an educated decision about what ideology to follow. It would be more in the spirit of what the education system should be. It should be a means of teaching children how to think for themselves. If they are given the evidence of the past of communism, then surely they would be against it if it's bad. Ultimately, it boils down to two possibilities for why the Floridian government would pass this. One is that Florida schools are simply not teaching enough about world history for students to understand the supposed risks of communism. And the second possibility is that the conservative government of Florida is afraid of rising opposition and wants to begin brainwashing future generations to solidify their position. And I would obviously say the second option is especially likely because the legislation is, again, extremely ideologically biased. Just the name alone implies that. It only targets communism and the entire left by extension, but leaves extreme right ideologies such as fascism unscathed, if you will. The decision to impose specifically anti-communist classes is a thinly veiled attempt to reduce opposition through state-led brainwashing and propaganda. And again, I'm not going to praise a dictatorial form of government, no matter what, no matter if it's fascist or communist, but this legislation reeks of dictatorship, and if you support liberalism and democracy, you really shouldn't support this kind of legislation. It's an attack on our democracy that is disguising itself as protection against communism. Nobody should celebrate the return of the Red Scare, because in the first Red Scare, you have these people's liberties being curbed with the excuse that it was to protect them from communism, and that communism ran amok within the United States. It turned out, though, that the most dangerous thing in our nation at that time was mostly people who claimed to defend democracy from communism. Let's not fall for this same trap again. All of these problems are showing a concerning trend that has existed in the United States recently. This nation is moving quickly towards a more authoritarian means of governance, which should be extremely concerning to everyone in the United States, except for maybe the elites. When a nation becomes more authoritarian, the only people who will ever benefit are the elites. And I hate to break it to you, but you are not part of this group. Every person in the United States who truly believes in democracy and freedom must oppose this trend because it will inevitably hurt every person in the United States. The insane and wholly unjust war with Iran was started without the approval of Congress and clearly only serves to distract people from the hideous situation at home. The United States has been fighting unnecessary and unjust wars under the guise that it would secure freedom for the better part of a century now, and this war is really not different in the slightest. We have spent billions of dollars to fight an unnecessary war that was unapproved by Congress and that didn't even accomplish its goals. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed as of April 20th. The decision to place ICE in airports was unsuccessful at shortening security lines, but it was definitely successful at increasing government power and instilling fear into many people. These are not the tactics of a state that appreciates its people. If the government actually gave a shit about fixing security lines, it would just pay its TSA agents and stop funding useless kill squads to enforce anti-human deportations, which have rapidly increased in severity since the Orange Man came into power. Finally, while the decision to create anti-communist classes to denounce the communist dictators of the 20th century sounds like it could be potentially well-meaning, we need to consider who's enacting this idea and who's supporting it. When a bunch of conservative and authoritarian right politicians seek to push, quote, anti-communist classes, unquote, it is just really an attempt to eliminate their opposition. Remember that the first victim of the rise of fascism has always been and will always be the communists because they are ideologically opposed to them. Regardless, the purpose of the so-called anti-communist classes should already be fulfilled by pre-existing and factual history classes. These classes that are being passed are a disturbing premise. If democracy is to be truly enforced, we must allow people to come to these conclusions themselves. We cannot teach children to be anti-communist, nor can we really teach them to be anti-fascist. This is the definition of indoctrination, is to force them to believe a specific stance on ideology rather than letting them come to that decision themselves. This is not what a functional democracy does. Instead, it teaches children to respect their fellow humans and their rights, and it teaches them the history and the beliefs of every ideology, which will then allow children to come to an educated decision and stance on the ideology themselves. The situation in this country is rapidly dwindling, and it seems increasingly unlikely, that the United States will be intact for the 2028 elections. It probably won't even be functional by the 2026 midterms, if we're going to be real. The first and most important thing is that we need to never conform to dictators. When the government does not follow the will of the people, it can and should never be supported by the people. We were given the Second Amendment rights for a reason, and we need to take advantage of them soon. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day and night. Stay safe in these uncertain times, and goodbye.